Hi, everybody. I'm Susan Miller, your host. This is our second weekly episode of Behind the Headlines, where we delve a little deeper into the news stories, particularly as they affect our fair city, New Westminster. While we are all relieved that the COVID vaccines are winging their way to Canada now, we're going to take a reality check on just what the COVID situation is in our area, which, in short, is not good. City Councillor Jamie McAvoy gives us the figures on the cases here in New West, and our MP, Peter Julian, is going to speak to just how fast the COVID vaccines are going to roll out. Maybe not as quickly as you might have hoped. Jamie McAvoy, who is also an historian, will tell us about life in lockdown during the 1918 flu pandemic too. Can you imagine lockdown without all the media we have now? His explanation may provide some comfort. Well, I imagine most of you are likely sick of COVID stories. After all, there are other issues out there that are important too. So we are going to start by talking to City Councillor Nadine Nakagawa about her push to have our city take a deep dive into the city's history with respect to the many First Nations who have some claim to the territory on which we live. And finally, this is the time of the year when many of us think about those that are vulnerable and often in a position where they can't speak for themselves. Pets, for example. Our Queensborough reporter, Nelson Ellis, talked to Nancy Miller, who is the Senior Animal Services Officer at the city's animal shelter. He wanted to find out how COVID has affected the shelter and its animals, and also whether they are expecting a flurry of people looking for pets to give for Christmas. Next up, my conversation with Nadine Nakagawa. City Councillor Nadine Nakagawa has always been interested in illuminating the stories and issues of those who don't fit into the so-called mainstream of our society, that is, those in power. Her latest initiative has been to have the city dig deep into the history of First Nations that occupied this area before it was settled by Europeans, and the truth of the city's past relationship with them. I started by asking her the intent of several motions that she put forward to City Hall, which were all passed. You recently put forward a number of motions at City Hall, all passed, with regard to truth and reconciliation with the First Nations, the ones locally. And I just wanted to know, what was the underlying intent of those motions?
Well, before I was elected, I was part of some reconciliation dialogues, and one of my intentions for running was to further the city's work on reconciliation. And I think it's building up a basis of the way that we want to do the work. So some of the motions that I've introduced are relating to the Truth and Reconciliation's calls to action. So endorsing the Truth and Reconciliation report. I've also, with Patrick Johnstone, brought forward a motion endorsing the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women report and asking that both the city and the New West Police Department address the calls to justice, calls for justice put forward in that report. Also brought forward some motions about truth before reconciliation, that in fact, this is something that Indigenous people say, is that you can't have reconciliation without truth. And as the first city in BC, as the historical capital, the city of New Westminster has directly and indirectly been part of taken actions harming and displacing Indigenous people on this territory, to the point that we don't even know whose territory that we're on. We know that the Kakite First Nation, who are a landless nation, have traditional claims here. But there's something like 32 other nations who also have claims to this territory, including the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Tsawwassen, the Katzie, the Coquitlam, the Kwantlen. Like there's a number of different groups, but we don't have any real record of that at the city. So I think that we need to look into what the city has done, similar to what the city of New Westminster did with the Chinese Canadian apology, that they looked into the history of their actions, took responsibility for it, and apologized. So I think we really need to look at that and develop a strong land acknowledgement of whose territory we're on and what nations we want relationship with, before we can begin the work of real reconciliation and decolonization. If you don't even know who you're reconciling with, how do you go about doing it?
So true. So how are you going to go about digging into this truth? I mean, a lot of the First Nations people have oral histories. So will you be pursuing that or having people pursue that?
Yeah, so we have our museum and archives who have done some work on this and, did work on the Chinese apology. So I think that's a really important point, is that from a colonial perspective, we often see that there is one truth, right? That only one person had this territory, that this is one story that we all have to agree upon. And I think we have to expand our understanding of what historical records are, like you said, oral history, um, and find ways to incorporate that into the way that the city understands its history. And I think we also have to be able to understand sometimes conflicting and competing histories, that we don't have to come to one agreed upon history. There can be multiple tellings of history. And so I think finding ways to offer alternate perspectives. But it's a really interesting question. I mean, we have consultants who are doing work on reconciliation with us who have expertise in this area. And I think there's an opportunity to partner with different post-secondary institutions on this kind of work. But of course, I think what you highlighted there is also incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous ways of storytelling as part of our practice. And that's something that the city doesn't frankly have expertise in, we've not done before. So it's a learning process, really.
So I guess the first thing to do is to dig into, how do you go about doing this, and who can help? Any thoughts about how that might be done, or would you work through the museum and their efforts, or how would you go about that?
Yeah, I think that the museum can start looking through our historical archives for sort of the city's telling of when did we remove Indigenous people, when did we imprison Indigenous people, the hanging of the Silkwood chiefs, for example. But then I think as we develop relationships with the various nations who have land claims here, I think it's also beginning the conversation with them about what stories do you have about this territory? Um, how do you understand it? Finding out place names from folks, and finding out their histories. So I think it's these processes are tied together. There's a bit of an unfortunate chicken and egg situation where it's like, do you build the relationship first and then do the truth telling? Do you need the truth before you build the relationships? Unfortunately, I think because the city is frankly far behind on this, we have to do them concurrently.
Well, it certainly makes sense to me that you'd have to do that. So you're very early in all this, but I know that the part of this, of course, would be public education of city hall and staff and so on. But public education, I would think, would be a big part of what you ultimately want to do. Do you have any thoughts about how you'd go about that, or is it just too early in the game?
No, I have lots of thoughts about this. So, for example, council had the opportunity to do a workshop with somebody named Brad Marsden, and he is a facilitator who basically does training on like the history of residential schools. And what I really like about his training, because I had the opportunity to take it before I was on council, and then I took it again once I was elected with my colleagues, is that it's both heart and mind. So he does a lot of, the fact is like I grew up, I'm not that old, but I grew up at a time when we did not teach the history of residential schools and colonization in school, really, right? We told it very much from the settlers' perspective, the explorers, etc. And so a lot of people, I think, even younger than me, but certainly older than me, have not had the opportunity to learn this information. They just don't know. So we have to do some information about just facts about what residential schools were and why the government did them. But then I think it's also important that we learn with our hearts as well, that he does a nice piece, and I don't want to give it away in case people have the opportunity to take his workshop. Um, that you really start to feel the impacts. It's not just, you don't just know it, you feel it too. And I think that that's an important part of learning. But there are many facilitators who do this type of work, decolonization, reconciliation, training about residential schools. And so I think trying to offer opportunities for the community to take part in that. I think another way is to, as the city learns, as the city builds relationships with the various nations and learns its history from a different perspective, that we share that information with the public as we learn. So I don't think we should just hold it all close, and then when we're done, we share it. I think we need to share as we're learning. Like, something I get asked about a lot is, a lot of people tend to ask me about land acknowledgement. What's the appropriate land acknowledgement for New Westminster? I do not know. And as such, a lot of people know that the Kakite Nation was here, and Chief Larrabee is a really present person in our community. She's been active and engaged for a really long time. So people really know her and appreciate her and respect her, as do I. And so a lot of people say the Kakite Nation and Coast Salish people. Well, we have come to learn that there are more nations with land claims here. And I have come to learn myself that apparently Coast Salish is a colonial term, and Indigenous people are beginning to not use that term to describe themselves. Well, that's something that's new to me. So I think we need to learn together and share this information and bring people along. And I also have a lot of thoughts about what I would describe as trauma porn. So as we've seen this past year with like the Black Lives Matter movement being really, really prominent, um, there's been a lot of tellings of traumatic stories relating to racism by Black people and other people of color. And in fact, everywhere you go, like if you read the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women Report, or you read Red Women Rising from the Downtown Eastside Women's Center, there are tons of traumatic stories to be shared. And yet we seem to keep focusing on having people share these traumatic narratives. And I'm very sensitive to the fact that if people want to share their stories, absolutely, we should give space to those. But we shouldn't be asking people, particularly Indigenous people, to continually re-traumatize themselves sort of for the white gaze, so that white people can understand or believe that these stories are what happened was harmful, and that these stories are true. I feel like there's a continuous focus on, tell me the worst thing that's ever happened to you, and I will judge whether or not what we should do to apologize. I think we need to move away from that. And again, if Indigenous people or any people of color or oppressed people want to share their stories, absolutely, that's up for them to do so. But I do not think that the city of New Westminster should be focusing on stories of trauma for the general public. There's plenty of that information out there. So if people want to read how harmful residential schools were, it's absolutely there for them to take it. So I think those are some things that I'm interested in, and things that I really want to avoid from the city of New West. But I think that the active learning by the community has to start now. It can't be the city as an organization learning independent from the public. I think we have to go together.
Well, I found it really fascinating when we were doing a little documentary on the Burnett River that there used to be about 10,000 Aboriginal people that sort of settled, at least temporarily, every year to catch fish, because it was a huge salmon run. And that's the kind of information that I think is very interesting.
Yeah, we don't see it reflected anywhere in our cities. Like, where is that story? How would somebody find that out? I don't know. But maybe we can make it visible by like putting up information near the Burnett River. There's lots of ways we can incorporate that.
Mm-hmm. I think it's a fantastic initiative. Now, I know that the city has another Truth and Reconciliation initiative going, and I'm not quite sure how yours connects, or, can you just explain that a little bit?
Yeah, so the city is working with a group called Castlemaine, and they have a background of working with many, many First Nations. And so they're really helping us, because the city of New Westminster, we have to acknowledge what we don't know. And the fact is that the city of New Westminster staff don't necessarily have an expertise in protocol and how to develop relationships with First Nations or the structure of First Nation governments. There's many different structures of governments. And so we're really leaning on their expertise to help us sort of with that preliminary relationship building and developing a framework for reconciliation. Now, I think it's important to say that reconciliation is about restoring relationships. It's about relationship building. It isn't decolonization. And I think that's where a lot of conversations are actually moving right now, is for things like the new aquatic center. We're looking at an Indigenous name for that aquatic center. What you're talking about, like what was the name in Halkomelem of the Burnett River? I don't know. I would love to know that. I'd love to know the name of the Fraser River. I'd love to know the name of this place on the hill where I live. Because I'm sure these places all had names. So that kind of decolonizing and indigenizing, I think, is separate from the work of reconciliation, but they're obviously related and interconnected. So these things really interact with each other nicely. I think that we have to build relationships, and we also have to work to address some colonial structures that don't serve us anymore.
So what you're saying is this other group is more involved in the reconciliation end of things? Is that what they're concerned about?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thanks so much.
Okay, thanks, Susan. Have a good rest of your day.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
My thanks to Nadine for her thoughtful parsing of all the steps that are important to finding a way to reconcile with our First Nations. Next up, our Queensborough reporter finds out what's happening at the city's animal shelter. Pets have been in big demand this year because many people have found themselves home alone, or at least isolated within a small group, and in need of a loving companion. Let's face it, pets can provide a lot of unconditional love and entertainment. Our Queensborough reporter, Nelson Ellis, talked with Senior Animal Services Officer Nancy Miller at the city's animal shelter to find out how COVID has affected them and if they're expecting a barrage of people looking for pets to give for Christmas. The holiday season upon us, and I'm just wondering, are people going to the shelter to get pets as gifts?
So not really. That's not really a thing a lot of people do anymore. And even if they do, it's not something that the shelter allows. When they're adopting an animal out, you can't buy the animal on behalf of somebody else. If you're going in and filling out the paperwork and taking the animal out of the shelter, you're the one that's going to be adopting it. But Nancy really stressed that an animal it's a big commitment. It's like a 10 to 20 year long commitment in some cases, and not just something you want to buy just as like a a casual gift for someone. But she did say if you do know someone who you think would be a good fit to have an animal in their life and they are looking to adopt, she made the suggestion of maybe getting a gift certificate for someone or saying that you would cover the adoption fees for them.
Yeah, that's a really great idea. Since the pandemic, has there been an uptick in people looking to adopt pets at the New West shelter?
Yeah, so what she told me was sort of earlier on and in the summer when people were staying home a bit more, there was a bit more of an uptick of people wanting to adopt puppies or kittens, maybe because they were getting lonely at home. But now it's sort of died back down and is kind of back to normal.
I understand that they have a pretty rigorous adoption process. Can you just tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, so someone who's looking to adopt an animal is going to fill out an application and also go through screening. They're also going to want to make sure someone has the financial resources to care for the animal because dogs and cats can be pretty expensive with things like food or uh, vet bills. It adds up pretty quickly. And also that the animal is going to be suited for their lifestyle. Like you're not going to adopt a Great Dane out to someone who lives in a small apartment and isn't home 12 hours a day. So they're really concerned with making sure that the animal goes to a good home and that after it's adopted out, the person isn't bringing it back right away, deciding that they can't handle having a pet.
Has the COVID had an impact on the animals in the shelter or the number of animals in the shelter?
Yeah, it has to some degree because they've had to suspend volunteers, which means that there is a limited number of people who are actually able to look after the animals in the shelter. So that means that they're taking in fewer animals, only those in desperate need. And and as they are like located in New Westminster, they're only able right now to take animals from people in New Westminster.
That's because it is in fact a city shelter.
Yes.
Do you know what animals they have in there now?
Yeah, so what I was told is that they have 3 dogs, 3 rabbits, 2 guinea pigs, 3 rats, and 1 cat.
Okay. And if people want to take a look for adoption purposes, I'll put up the link for people so they can see that. And the other thing is, I know that Christmas time people are often thinking about donating. Is the animal shelter looking for donations, and what kind of donations are they looking for?
Yeah, they are looking for donations, only new things because of COVID and concerns around that. And what Nancy told me is that they have an Amazon list up where people can buy things for them from there, and that seemed to have worked pretty well for them.
Thanks, Nelson, for finding out the story of the animal shelter. Next, our MP Peter Julian tells us the hard facts about the vaccine rollout. Of course, we're all excited that plane loads of COVID vaccine are winging their way to Canada and that vaccinations are starting up this week. But the hard reality is, according to MP Peter Julian, is that the vaccination of the Canadian population may not be as fast as we all hoped. There is still a long, dark tunnel ahead for most of us, and a lot of questions about how the government has handled the acquisition of the vaccines. I talked to Peter on November the 27th. Any comments about how the government has gone about acquiring the COVID vaccines and how they're rolling them out?
Yeah, that's a tough question. Don Davies, who's the health critic for the NDP, has been, and Jagmeet Singh as well, has been asking questions every day on this. The sad truth is twofold. First off, the government has only secured about 3 million doses from now until next summer. And so when Mr. Trudeau says, when I say 3 million doses, I mean that's actually 6 million doses of specific types of vaccines. So it would support 3 million Canadians. And so the government talks about all these options that it has and the millions of possible millions of doses of vaccines that may be available. But the reality is, in terms of what will actually be delivered, it's about 3 million doses. Now, there's over 4.5 million Canadians over the age of 70. Including my parents who are in their 90s, who are the most vulnerable. And when you think of the emergency frontline workers, emergency responders, elderly Canadians, all that need to be vaccinated, for the government to only really have half of what is the minimum requirement, even just to handle the most vulnerable, shows that Mr. Trudeau didn't know what he was doing. And secondly, of course, in none of these agreements has he negotiated the actual manufacture of the doses and the vaccines here in Canada, which means Canada is subject to doses being produced in other countries, and we get at the back of the line. And this is information that has just come out in the last few days. So what we have been proposing is that we need to reestablish what we used to have in Canada with Connaught Laboratories, for example, Canadian publicly owned laboratory that produced vaccines, produced insulin. Canada has a proud tradition of being in the forefront of medical research, and successive conservative and liberal governments sold all that off. All of the Frappier Institute in Montreal, Connaught Laboratories in Toronto, and others publicly owned laboratories have been sold off. That was a right-wing push that has been to our great detriment. And so what the NDP is proposing is we rebuild our public infrastructure, publicly owned laboratories and publicly owned vaccine manufacturing. That means that if there is another pandemic, and we know this might be a pandemic once in a century, but every decade we have a fairly, not as serious as this one, but still a substantial pandemic. We need to be able to produce the vaccines and do the research here in Canada and not be subject to pharmaceutical companies and their lobbyists. And so this is a very important lesson learned. In the meantime, we'll be pushing Trudeau government to fix the errors he's made over the last few months and make sure that there's sufficient number of vaccines for the highly vulnerable through this pandemic, for frontline workers, for emergency responders, for hospital employees. And in that way, we can protect them all until sufficient vaccines are available for everybody in Canada.
I recently read that the expectation is that half the population of Canada would be vaccinated by September, which I think is awfully slow. But you're saying, I think that it's going to be slower than that.
The numbers are actually lower than that, and this is the problem. I think Mr. Trudeau has changed his story a number of times. Last August, he said we would be producing vaccines in Canada. That's not the case. They didn't negotiate that. So I'm actually apprehensive of how many errors this government has made, compounded by the former Conservative government selling off our public assets as well. And so we've had two successive governments that have been very detrimental to public health.
It is a sad story. I've read quite a bit about the Connaught Labs, and it is a very sad thing that's happened to it. In any case, Peter, do you have any final words that you'd like to pass on to us new Westminsterites?
I hope people continue to work together. There's been a tremendous amount of solidarity through this pandemic. Our emergency responders are doing an incredible job. Our city council and our mayor are really working as hard as they can. The school board trustees, our teachers, our healthcare workers, nurses and doctors at the Royal Columbian, frontline workers who make sure that we're being provided with the food that we need for our families. I mean, these are all the heroes through this pandemic, and that's why every night we try to pay tribute as much as we can to them. And we've got to keep them front and center in our thoughts. I'm hoping certainly for everybody in New Westminster that folks keep safe and healthy during this pandemic. We still have, tragically, ways to go, and so we have to stick together and keep safe and keep healthy and be smart, wear our masks, keep socially distanced, and keep working hard for an end to this pandemic. And it means being kind to ourselves and being kind to each other in this city. And that, I know the residents of New Westminster rise to the challenge, as we have in every previous crisis in our city, which is the oldest in Western Canada. We've lived through a lot, and I think we'll survive this too. We just have to do it together.
Thanks so much, Peter, for taking time out to speak to us. We really appreciate it. And you be safe. I know that you having to travel back and forth to Ottawa adds an extra level of risk. And so be safe. Thanks to Peter Julian for being so generous with his time. And yes, let's keep to the rules and be kind to all. Next up, a fascinating discussion with historian and city councillor Jamie McAvoy, who is keeping us up to date on the COVID situation in our area, and also how this pandemic compares to the one in 1918. It's very illuminating, and it does give you pause for thought.
So, Jamie, last week the news was pretty bad, and this week the news is even worse. Bonnie Henry has us all under lockdown. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that?
To be honest with you, a lot of deaths and a lot of cases. So province-wide, I think the overall situation was 11 new deaths yesterday, 737 new cases, but 469 of those are in our own Fraser Health. And then you consider there's 342 people in hospital, right? 87 of those are intensive care. There's about more than 9,500 cases, of which 1,875 are in long-term care, 1,200 residents of long-term care active cases. So it's not a situation that is looking good right now or looking happy in terms of having some really good news in the next few weeks. I hate to say it, just not looking good that way. And there are some local numbers, not as many, but we know that there's been 624 cases for residents of New Westminster, but 95 of those have been in the past week.
Wow.
So we're at the height of it.
We hope it's the height.
We hope it's the height.
Yeah. I mean, I'm being so surprised at kind of the virulence of it. I mean, I just totally unexpected to me.
Well, the virus likes crowding, that's why it likes old age homes. People in old age homes have been more likely to die from it, but they've also been more likely to catch it because it likes crowded places. So certain workplaces, if the most crowded place is going to be your Christmas gathering and COVID happens to be there, it would love to be a guest and mingle with everybody you invite and show up in the statistics 2 weeks later.
So now, where is it happening now? Is it still in the seniors' residences where we're having most of the COVID cases and deaths, breakouts, whatever?
We're having most deaths among seniors. Most of those are in old age homes, but where it really seems to be spreading now is in small gatherings at people's private homes.
Oh, really? They're small gatherings. So they can really drill down and figure that out.
they can drill down through the contact tracing, and then they can figure, they can figure it out, and they can also genetically trace the virus.
So that is very, very important for people to know, because I'm sure there's a lot of people thinking, well, I mean, we could get together with our six or whatever. Why can't we do it now? But that's a wake-up call.
One of the things that Dr. Henry has identified is a lot of people catching COVID now think that they have been cautious enough. They think they follow the precautions. It's not really so much the people who are just flaunting it. It's actually people who thought they were following the precautions, but maybe they didn't wear a mask. Maybe they had somebody over, those kinds of things, and it's not a disease that forgives you for that one time. It, you could think of COVID as looking for an opportunity. And we have, you know, it, it, it can be hard on people, but we have to be on our guard all the time if we want to be part of this worldwide movement that brings this thing under control so it doesn't really harm more people.
Mhm. So do you know about Royal Columbian Hospital? Do you know, has it reached its capacity as far as beds and ICU units and so on? Have they reached their capacity at this point? Are you aware of that?
No, we're doing well in BC in terms of capacity. It's about 2/3 of intensive care units and less than half of all hospital beds are filled up right now. Um, it is disrupting other minor procedures to some degree where people would have to stay in hospital, but right now we're not doing too badly. We're not looking at setting up an emergency hospital in BC Place, which the government was ready to do in the early days. So it's not looking too bad in BC, but we know from looking at other jurisdictions like Quebec, for example, that if it gets out of control, those spaces will fill up really quickly.
Mhm. So now the second wave, do you attribute it to largely people having to meet inside now? Is that where you think the problems are arising?
Yeah, that was the expectation back in the summer, is that there'd be a second wave in the fall when people start having to meet indoors again. And in fact, if you look worldwide, there hasn't really been some countries are still in their first wave. It's never been brought under control. But if you look worldwide, there hasn't really been a second wave in countries where it's always comfortable to go outdoors. It's mainly in our northern countries where you have to have indoor heat and ventilation that we've had the second wave.
Yeah. Mhm. So I guess your Christmas is not as you expected it might be.
In my family, we're going to postpone the extended family Christmas, so we're still going to do it. We're going to keep all the presents. Um, my mom optimistically thinks it'll be the end of January. I'm not that optimistic, but we've postponed Christmas so we can still celebrate it when there's a time we can all get together, even if that time has to be next summer in the backyard again.
I'm wondering about what was lockdown like in the pandemic of the flu pandemic of 1918. What it have looked like to those people?
It did look a lot different. One difference would be that there was a lot more crowding in 1918, right? We had orphanages instead of foster care. We had a lot of workers' housing where people just kind of lived in barracks. You could have a bunch of bunk beds in one room. And people tended to live in smaller homes with larger families. So lockdown for people in the past, it was often crowded, and it could be pretty boring. After the first month of playing cards and reading books, there was no radio yet, no TV, no internet. Um, and so in the 1919 pandemic, people were really chafing at the boredom. And sometimes people broke quarantine. Uh, Even in terms of books, the literacy rate was high, but it certainly wasn't everybody. In some houses, the only books they would have is a copy of the Bible and a copy of the school reader. So it wasn't even like people could go look at their shelves and pick out a book to read.
In those days when people got ill with the flu, did they go to the hospital, or were some people allowed to go to the hospital, or what? How did they dispense with medical help?
It was actually pretty mixed. So I don't know the figure for people who are sick, but for people who died, it was about 50-50. Um, about There was about 20% who just died in other places, like um, died at work, died on the street, died out on the water, and typically that influenza would kill people through pneumonia, and it could take a couple of weeks. But there were some people who got sick in the morning and were dead by nightfall. So of that other 80%, it was 50-50 between people who were in hospital and people who were in homes. And the hospitals were completely overloaded, just really stuffed. They had an idea of separating people with curtains, but there were people in the hallways, there were people in the attics, um, and there were people who were at home because they didn't trust hospitals, um, or they couldn't afford them. So it was split.
Well, that's true. We didn't have a public healthcare system at that point.
That's right. So if you had a decent job, your employer or your union might have a healthcare or hospital plan for you, but for anyone else, you'd have to be able to pay for it.
Now, this is all pre-antibiotics. So what kind of things did they do to help people?
To be honest with you, they didn't know what to do. They try to get people through it, right? They try to keep your liquids going, your nutrition, keep you comfortable, keep you cool. But even in 1918, there was still the use of leeches in medical treatment. Drugstores sold all kinds of tonics that were supposed to be a treatment. Cinnamon was really popular. You could get extract of cinnamon, buy that, and that was supposed to help you with the influenza. You know,
Wow.
we still have snake oil medicine like that today. And they had liquor. Um,
Oh,
in those days, a doctor might actually prescribe you liquor as a treatment for something. So, if you're not feeling well, the doctor might prescribe you some whiskey. You go get some whiskey at the drugstore instead of at the pub down the street. And that was actually a major concern because government was really concerned about protecting the supply lines. Today, we're worried about protecting the supply lines for the vaccine. Back then, they were really worried about protecting the supply lines for liquor so doctors would still be able to prescribe it to patients.
were all people allowed into the hospitals that could go, or was there were people of different races and so on excluded from hospital?
So nobody was excluded. There was some segregation, though. So Vancouver General Hospital, people of color would be in the basement of the hospital and not on the main floors. That was true of Royal Columbian for a while. It wasn't true of St. Mary's Hospital. The Catholic hospitals never accepted that kind of segregation. And in fact, in the 19 influenza really started to break that down because it just wasn't possible to neatly separate people with so many people sick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would imagine the sickness would have take a major toll on the people that were helping. I mean, the doctors and nurses and so on.
There was a time when almost every staff person at Royal Columbian Hospital was sick. Um, Doctors and nurses in BC died in the dozens. And so the call for volunteers, there were people volunteering to be nurses who got a half-hour training so they could fill in because the regular nurses were sick, and in some cases dying. And a lot of teachers died. Uh, and the reason for that is teachers really came forward to be volunteers in the hospitals. The schools were closed, and the idea was that for all the children that were in hospitals, maybe seeing their teachers would at least be something that would comfort the children. And teachers volunteered in large numbers to help in the hospitals because they weren't working in the schools, they were available. And I remember reading on something like 14 teachers in BC died volunteering in the hospital during the Spanish influenza.
Do you have any idea what percentage of the New West population would have died during that influenza?
Um, You know what? I don't know the total number, but it probably would have been similar to Vancouver. So there was a population of 14,000 in New West. The death rate in Vancouver was about 23 per thousand. So, you know, it was high, right? New Westminster had days when uh, an average of 20 people a day were dying in the city. And so, if, you know, you you look at I think in the pandemic there were 650 people who were sick in New Westminster in one time out of that population of 14,000.
Wow. So what about soldiers? Was it, I mean, was the thinking that the soldiers were bringing back this pandemic from the trenches in the First World War? Is that, was that the inciting event?
Yeah, and you know that was actually understood, but it wasn't understood soon enough. Um, so soldiers returning home were spreading influenza um, from Europe and from the combat zones of Europe. There's no doubt about it. And in fact, it can be measured. We know that some cities would not let soldiers get off in their city, get off the train, and those cities did much better in terms of contagion. So it's a real tragedy. And more people died in Canada from the influenza than uh, died in combat in World War One. It's something like 50,000 people died in Canada out of a population of 8 million. But it's a real tragedy. People wanted their sons and their husbands home. We're celebrating the end of the war, um, and mostly without realizing we're spreading this deadly disease right across the country.
You know what? Something definitely to think about in Remembrance Day, because, you know, those who weren't killed in the trenches, they had a really good chance of being killed shortly thereafter from the flu. So it's very sad.
Yeah, one of those people was one of the people who had it was my great grandfather. He didn't die, but he was a soldier in World War One, um, and he caught influenza near the end of the war. He had my great grandmother and three children back home. And so while many of the other families were celebrating the return of their loved ones, he was on the verge of death of influenza in a hospital in London for another year before he could go home, which must have been agonizing for families who had to wait and see what would happen.
Right. Any other thoughts about the flu then? You know, I mean, I think it's interesting comparing what's happening then to now, because in a way it makes you feel lucky, really.
Uh, you know, that pandemic, it had a different impact. It mainly killed people aged 20 to 39. It killed young adults mainly, because it worked in a different way than this virus did. It worked by overactivating people's immune systems, and then it would attack themselves. Most people actually died from pneumonia. Um, and the impact on the community at a time when people were not so sure of what to do, you can really compare and say what it's not as bad as it was then, but it could be. It could get as bad as it was then if we weren't taking some kind of public health precautions. It had a huge impact on the city. It would have been a time when every family had somebody or knew of somebody who had died from it. And in workplaces were hit hard because workplaces were all crowded in those days. And just, you know, the impact on people's health and also their morale and mental well-being, it was really strong.
Mhm. Well, also having that age group, which is, you know, young people probably up to 40 or so, they're kind of the, you know, they're the kind of the people that are developing careers and developing families and so on. And of course, many couldn't have a family because there wasn't enough males to go around. And um, uh, I mean, it's just a huge amount of talent lost, I'm sure.
There was no such thing as a pension or welfare. And you know, in those days, that concept of the breadwinner usually was the male of the family. And so They would leave behind widows. They would leave behind kids who would then have no financial support or desperately try to find some financial support. So it had long-lasting consequences. Although once it was over, it's roughly at the end of March of 1919. It had long-lasting consequences, but people didn't want to think about it. They wanted to get on with their life, and so there was no memorials, for all the doctors that died or anything like that. People had gone through a real hardship and tragedy, and they just wanted to move on.
Yeah, well, we never thought about pandemics really until now, and it's very interesting to kind of realize that they're have a huge impact on our history. One thing that comes to mind for me, was there more of a willingness to allow women to work once after this flu pandemic?
Actually, it did. Part of that was the war itself. With so many of the men away, women were filling in roles in society that they hadn't filled in before. And then there was this expectation that women would step aside from industrial jobs, particularly once the men got back home. But it didn't work out that way. This is the time period when we would soon have women's suffrage in BC. There was just this general feeling, people had gone through war, they had gone through influenza, and there was this general feeling among women that they took up what needed to be taken up, and they weren't just going to go back, and be good child bearers and work in the kitchen. There really was a sense that we as women had filled these roles, and we are not just going to step back into the shadows now. And so you come out of that in British Columbia and a lot of Canada, with women winning the right to vote, for example.
So when did women get the right to vote? 31?
In British Columbia, well, it's complicated because there was an election during the war where only certain women were allowed to vote.
I see.
If you had a husband or a son in the war, you were allowed to vote in a previous federal election, which is the government's sneaky way of making sure the electorate supported the war. But I think it was 1919 when women got the vote in British Columbia.
And later for other places in Canada. Just another thing that comes to mind, what did people do in New West when what are the main industries or whatever in New West in those days?
Fishing and lumber.
Okay.
It was all about fishing and lumber, and it was mainly lumber. It was mainly sawmills, that kind of labor.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if you were employed, you were twice as likely to get sick as someone who was unemployed.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, that was very interesting, Jamie. I love this connection with history.
Thanks, Jamie McAvoy, for your fascinating insights into our lives today compared to those of the past. And next week, I look forward to Jamie's telling us why it is that Canada is not making its own vaccines. After all, we're a very educated and savvy population. I suspect that successive governments prefer to think of our country as hewers of wood and drawers of water, rather than putting money into science. But that's my little editorial aside. Thank you all for watching. If you're enjoying the program, look for a new episode every Sunday, and do spread the word about it. If you want to help out in any way by reporting on stories or by helping out on the technical side, please connect with us. Our website and portal for our programs is www.NewWest.tv. Have a good week, stay safe, and be kind. It's difficult for us all. Ta-ta for now.